They smiled in yearbook photos. They played video games. They texted friends. Some were honor students. Others wrestled quietly with trauma no one ever noticed. But when the headlines hit, teen arrested for brutal murder, the nation collectively gasped. What happened? How did someone so young become capable of something so dark? The answer often begins behind closed doors. Take the case of 16-year-old Tyler Hadley. In 2011, the Florida teen invited friends over for a house party. Nearly 60 people showed up. They drank, danced, posted on social media. What they didn't know was that Tyler's parents were dead, bludgeoned to death with a hammer by their own son just hours before the first guest arrived. Their bodies were hidden in the master bedroom. Tyler acted like any other teenager hosting a party. He laughed. He posed for pictures. One classmate even said he seemed weirdly chill. But the mask he wore that night, the one of a typical suburban kid, was hiding something unthinkable. And he wasn't alone. Teen killers don't usually look like killers. That's what makes them terrifying. In 2014, Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier lured their friend Peyton Lutner into the woods in Waukesha, Wisconsin, and stabbed her 19 times. They were just 12 years old. Their motive? A fictional character named Slender Man. The crime shocked the world, not just because of its brutality, but because it forced a new question into the public consciousness. What happens when children lose touch with reality? Criminologists often point out that teenage killers are rarely born evil. Instead, their actions are the result of a slow build, an erosion of empathy, a disconnection from consequences, and a deep, unresolved inner pain. In many cases, there are warning signs: isolating behavior, obsession with violence, animal cruelty, fascination with death. But sometimes, the signs are subtle or dismissed entirely by overwhelmed parents or underfunded school systems. When 17-year-old Brenda Spencer opened fire on an elementary school in 1979, killing 2 and injuring 9, she later told police, "I don't like Mondays. This livens up the day." She had a history of depression and lived in squalor with her alcoholic father, who had given her the rifle as a gift. These early cases set the stage for an urgent discussion we still wrestle with today. How do we identify and help troubled youth before they become killers? What pushes a teenager from fantasy into violence? And what role do family, media, and mental health systems play in that descent? This story doesn't aim to sensationalize. It aims to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth. The people we fear the most might not be hiding in the shadows. They might be sitting at the school cafeteria, scrolling through TikTok, or walking the halls of a quiet suburban high school. Through this 4-part series, we'll look at real-life cases, break down the psychology behind young murderers, and explore what society can do to intervene. Because behind every horrific act is a story, and behind every story is a mind, sometimes fractured, sometimes ignored, and sometimes crying for help in silence. Violent behavior doesn't manifest overnight. It builds quietly, dangerously, and often unnoticed. In teenage killers, the seeds of destruction are frequently planted long before the crime is ever committed. While the public often searches for one definitive cause, the truth is far more complex. It's a tangled web of childhood trauma, psychological breakdowns, poor support systems, and exposure to violence. Start with family dynamics. Studies show that many young murderers come from homes marked by neglect, abuse, or instability. In these environments, emotions become a battlefield. Love is conditional. Anger is constant. Fear becomes normalized. For teens, the line between survival and destruction begins to blur. Ethan Couch, remembered for his 2013 affluenza case, didn't commit murder with intent, but his drunk driving killed 4 people. Raised in a home of extreme privilege, Ethan's upbringing lacked boundaries or consequences. His lawyers famously argued he didn't understand right from wrong because of his upbringing. The case became a symbol of how both neglect and excess can warp a child's sense of accountability. In contrast, Kip Kinkle grew up in a loving household. But beneath the surface, he struggled with deep-seated psychosis. In 1998, at just 15 years old, Kip murdered his parents and opened fire at Thurston High School in Oregon, killing 2 students and injuring 25. His journals, later revealed in court, were filled with rage, suicidal thoughts, and fantasies of mass violence. Mental illness, untreated and ignored, had been eating away at him for years. Then there's peer influence and the internet. Today's teenagers are more connected than ever, yet more isolated. Online forums, social media, and dark corners of the web can expose vulnerable teens to disturbing ideologies. In the Slender Man case, Morgan Geyser was later diagnosed with early-onset schizophrenia, but her immersion in online horror lore fed her delusions and drove her actions. Violent video games, while not directly causal, often serve as emotional release or fantasy rehearsal grounds. For mentally unstable teens, they may reinforce violent solutions to perceived problems. Another contributing factor is bullying, relentless, sometimes invisible. Many school shooters cite social isolation and humiliation as key motivators. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the Columbine killers, documented their hatred of classmates and teachers in journals and videos. Their pain became fuel for mass revenge. Experts emphasize that while millions of teenagers experience anger, depression, or hardship, only a tiny fraction turn to murder. So what distinguishes those who do? Psychologists point to a loss of empathy, a breakdown in conscience. When teens stop seeing others as human, anything becomes possible. Yet even that detachment rarely comes from nowhere. It often grows from a combination of unaddressed mental illness, family dysfunction, societal neglect, and a desperate need to feel in control. As one forensic psychiatrist noted, the scariest thing about many teen killers is how ordinary they appear, until you scratch the surface. The challenge, then, isn't just identifying dangerous youth. It's creating systems that intervene early, support mental health, build trust in adults, and offer alternatives to violence. It's about catching the fall before the impact. Because behind every monster is a moment, a turning point where someone could have stepped in. When teenagers commit murder, the question of intent becomes crucial. Did they snap in a moment of rage? Or did they plan their crimes with chilling calculation? The answer is often what determines how they are judged, not just in courtrooms but in the court of public opinion. One of the most haunting examples of cold, premeditated murder came from the case of Alyssa Bustamante. In 2009, at just 15 years old, Alyssa lured her 9-year-old neighbor Elizabeth Olton into the woods in Missouri. She strangled her, slit her throat, and buried her in a shallow grave. When investigators later found Alyssa's journal, they discovered an entry written the night of the murder. "I just ****ing killed someone. I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them. It was amazing." There was no question about impulse here. Alyssa had dug the grave days before. She had tested various methods. She later said she wanted to know what it felt like to kill. Cases like Alyssa's force us to confront the unnerving truth. Some teens kill not out of passion or desperation, but curiosity, a desire to feel something, anything. Contrast this with crimes of rage. In 2017, 16-year-old Adrian Beltra stabbed his best friend multiple times during a heated argument over a girl. Witnesses said it escalated fast. There was no planning, no preparation, just a moment of intense emotion and irreversible action. This distinction between snap and strategy becomes central in legal proceedings. Planned murders often result in harsher sentences, sometimes life without parole. Crimes of passion, though still tragic, may be viewed through a slightly more sympathetic lens. But determining intent in adolescence is complicated. The teenage brain, specifically the prefrontal cortex responsible for judgment and impulse control, isn't fully developed. Neuroscience shows that teens are more likely to take risks, misread social cues, and struggle with long-term consequences. But some still show a level of cold planning that's indistinguishable from adult killers. In the infamous Columbine case, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold spent over a year planning their attack. They wrote manifestos, filmed videos, stockpiled weapons. They created a blueprint for mass violence. Their attack wasn't a spontaneous act, it was a mission. Experts believe Eric Harris was a true psychopath. Charming, manipulative, remorseless. While Dylan Klebold was more depressive, emotionally unstable, and influenced by Eric. Together, their dynamic became deadly. Understanding the mental profiles of teen killers is vital. Some show traits of antisocial personality disorder, others struggle with untreated schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or severe depression. The motivations can range from revenge and fame-seeking to delusions and peer pressure. A study by the U.S. Secret Service and Department of Education on school shootings found that in over 75% of cases, the attacker had told someone about their plans in advance. Yet, in most instances, the warnings were ignored or not taken seriously. This raises another painful reality. Many teen killers could have been stopped if someone had acted, if someone had listened. In the aftermath of these crimes, communities search for answers. What did we miss? Could we have prevented this? The truth is, some teen killers give off clear signals: obsession with weapons, violent writings, threats. Others hide their darkness behind perfect grades and fake smiles. Whether it's a sudden break or a slow burn, what unites many teen murderers is the same thing that isolates them: an inability to connect, to feel understood, to process rage without destruction. Understanding their minds doesn't excuse their actions, but it may be the only way to stop the next one before it starts. When the crime scene is cleared, the headlines fade, and the trial ends, what happens to the teen who committed murder? Are they locked away for life, rehabilitated, forgotten, or do they live in a permanent gray zone between guilt and psychological damage? This final chapter dives into the most controversial aspect of juvenile crime: redemption. In many Western legal systems, including the U.S., teens can be charged and sentenced as adults for severe crimes like murder. That means some face decades or life behind bars, sometimes without the possibility of parole. Critics argue this ignores what science tells us: that adolescent brains are still developing, and many young offenders can change. Consider the case of Cyntoia Brown. Though not a typical teen killer, she was 16 when she fatally shot a man who had solicited her for sex. Her story sparked a national conversation. Raised in a broken home, trafficked as a minor, and suffering from severe trauma, Cyntoia was sentenced to life in prison. But years later, through education, advocacy, and public support, she was granted clemency. Her transformation became a symbol of hope for second chances. But not all stories end in redemption. Teen killers like Joshua Phillips, who murdered an 8-year-old neighbor at age 14 and hid her body under his waterbed, have shown remorse, but remain incarcerated for life. The public's appetite for punishment, especially in heinous crimes, often outweighs sympathy for age or circumstance. Psychologists argue that rehabilitation is possible, but only with early intervention, long-term therapy, and structured environments. Programs that focus on cognitive behavioral therapy, empathy development, and trauma healing have shown promise. But they are expensive and rare. In Norway, for example, the juvenile justice system prioritizes rehabilitation over punishment. Their recidivism rate is among the lowest in the world. In contrast, the U.S. has some of the highest rates of juvenile reoffending, suggesting that a punitive approach may not be the answer. Still, there are hard truths to face. Some teen killers exhibit deep-rooted psychopathy. They show no remorse, no empathy, and no desire to change. In these cases, incarceration may be the only safe option for them and society. The debate rages on: should age mitigate responsibility? Can someone who commits a monstrous act at 14 or 15 truly ever reintegrate into society? And what about the victims and their families? Do they get justice if the perpetrator walks free? Ultimately, society must grapple with two truths. Some teenagers do terrible, unforgivable things. Some of them can grow, change, and redeem their lives if given the chance. This story is not about excusing. It's about understanding. Because behind every young killer is a path. And maybe, just maybe, understanding that path is the first step to making sure fewer teens ever follow it. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, hit the notification bell, and join our growing true crime community.